Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we are joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard Comstock and author Nancy L. Todd for a fascinating discussion about the armories around New York. The discussion will be led by retired state archivist and trust board member Tom Ruller. This session will explore the rich history and architectural significance of New York's armories, many of which resemble medieval castles, and their roles in local communities. We're excited to learn about these unique landmarks and their impact on New York's cultural heritage. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard Comstock is the steward of the New York State Archives Partnership Trust. He has an extensive background in military service. One of his many passions is the different architectural fixtures in our surrounding towns and neighborhoods, specifically the diverse armories around the great state of New York. Nancy L. Todd is an architectural historian and a program analyst at the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. She's a past recipient of the New York State Division of Military and Naval Affairs Adjutant General's Award for extraordinary contributions to the historic preservation of New York's armories. Tom Ruller retired from his position as New York State Archivist in 2023. An active professional for 35 years, Tom is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust, for which we are very grateful. For those of you who have joined us today, welcome. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So you can feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. And now, I am pleased to introduce retired Lieutenant Colonel Richard Comstock, Nancy L. Todd, and Tom Ruller.
Thank you very much, Josie. It's Nancy. It's great to see you in person. And hopefully you can hear us without any trouble and everything is good there. First, before we go too far, yesterday was Veterans Day, and I'm honored to be seated next to one of our veterans. And Richard, thank you very much for your service, and anyone who is participating in the program today who has served our country, thank you very much for your service. Our program is about armories across the state, and I'm going to show this about 10 times, and there'll be a wonderful slide. This is the definitive book. Unfortunately, we have the definitive author with us today to talk about armories across New York. Most of our presentation today is a set of slides and some wonderful photos. So rather than look at us as much as you can, I think we're going to open up our slideshow, and I'll turn it over to Richard to kick us off.
Thank you. I wanted to I'm very happy to be here today and talking about something that's near and dear to my heart. What you're looking at right now is the Saratoga Springs Armory. It was put into service in 1891 and was originally built to house the 22nd Separate Company of the New York Guard. I, having spent 16 years with the New York Army National Guard, after 4 years on active duty, I became very familiar with armories and around New York State. And some of the armories that I called home for a number of years included, and if we could go to slide 3, included the Culver Road Armory in Rochester, New York. It was the home of the 209th Field Artillery Group. And the next was the Main Street Armory, which again in Rochester, New York, which was the home to the 1st Battalion, 209th Field Artillery. We included a little history of the postcard, and I'll talk about postcards in a second, just to show you that this postcard was actually postmarked in 1909, which gives you a perspective on how long these things have been around. And then finally, the next slide being the massive Kingsbridge Road Armory on Kingsbridge Road in the Bronx, New York, which was my home for actually 7 of my years in the New York Army National Guard. My office was actually in one of those turrets that you see behind the next to the, if you will, the armory. And we'll talk about the significance of next to the armory in a minute. I got into a serious habit of collecting postcards, and I think Nancy did as well. Many of what you'll see today are postcards and are out of our collections of postcards. And in fact, in the book, in Nancy's book itself, there are a number of photos or pictures, if you will, of postcards that had been portraying armories throughout New York State. I think it might be helpful to back up just slightly and talk a little bit about the evolution of the New York Army National Guard. A year ago, we had one of these online discussions talking about New York's participation in world wars, and we used my grandfather's experience as an example. In the turn of the century, and I'm talking 1800s to 1900s, New York militia was organized as the New York Guard. Prior to that, it had been a local militia, and we'll talk about a little bit about that as we talk more about arsenals and what have you. But the New York Guard basically was a New York organization. Its responsibility was to New York State and to the government of New York State. That was effectively changed early in the 20th century, and the New York Guard evolved or was redesignated the New York Army National Guard. There were remnants of the New York Guard that continued to remain, and ostensibly their mission had been to just man the armories in the event that the armories were no longer able or I should say maintained, was no longer staffed by the units which were assigned to them. But the New York Army National Guard, as opposed to the New York Guard, had dual responsibility. They were responsible to the state of New York, and they were responsible to the federal government. As part of the New York Army National Guard, I was mobilized in the late 70s for a correctional officer strike, which required us to go into the prison to basically take the place of the correction officers who were on strike. Also, to illustrate the federal responsibility that the New York Army National Guard has, you'll see in many of public spaces now, particularly train stations and the like, soldiers, armed soldiers, providing security for public space. And those are generally National Guardsmen and women who have been federalized, if you will, to provide that kind of security. Prior in the New York Guard, prior to the establishment of the New York Army National Guard with dual responsibilities, the New York Guard, if you were to be federalized from the New York Guard, you had to be discharged from the Guard and then brought on active duty. So it was a big change, and again, the dual responsibilities that the New York Army National Guard currently has continue to or basically evolved from that reorganization that took place at the beginning of the 20th century.
So many of the older armories were New York Guard armories.
That's correct.
New York buildings built for the New York, I'll say the New York militia or the New York Army.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until later that it became sort of the federal state connection became much stronger.
Right.
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 So Nancy nodding her head. So I must be getting this right. So
again, going back to the first slide, the Saratoga Armory, this particular postcard was postmarked in 1911, so you can get an idea that the Army was about 20 years old when it was postmarked. Go to slide 2. And, just to give you a brief agenda, we're gonna talk about arsenals to armories, and I think that there are important distinctions between the two, but I think it's well to know that a lot of what we see as armories today really evolved from the arsenals that were in effect or in use in the early 1800s. We're going to talk a little bit about the DNA, what I call the DNA of the armory. That is, armories have architectural significance, they have military significance, and social significance. No matter whether the armory was in a rural area or a urban setting, they had tremendous social significance, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along.
So can we start by talking a little bit about the evolution of arsenals? And this is a photograph of an arsenal, which was responsible really just for storing armaments. It didn't house people. It was just a magazine, for a lack of a better term.
This is the Ogdensburg Arsenal in 1858.
Got it. So, but the evolution of arsenal to armory, there's a number of different contexts in which this occurs. Nancy, can you talk a little bit about, why there are these armories in almost every significant town across the state?
Well, that's a big question. Actually, the arsenal that you're showing, there were about 12 of those that were built in the 1850s. And prior to that, and this is actually a very stylish, military-ish, imposing, fine example of architecture of the period. We go back much earlier to as early as 1799 and the first half of the 19th century, where most arsenals were just utilitarian masonry structures that were housing the local, not even regional, but the local militia stored their weapons and arms, and sometimes the bigger ones might actually manufacture stuff, but that's more of like the Watervliet arsenal that manufactured arms. So in the state context of state controlled stuff, they stored their guns. And prior to those arsenals, from the colonial era, when they initially started out with the conscripted militia, later went to the volunteer militia, but in the colonial era, every single able-bodied man was man. Yes, man, no women. Men were ordered to carry some sort of arms to be called into action in any threats. And at that point, it often meant Native American incursions, whatever. And so there were no such thing. I mean, the people kept them in their basements or their attics, or maybe they were fortunate to have it in the local bar. By the early 1800s, they started building these facilities, but they were very, very much out in far suburbs. Well, there are no suburbs, but far away from population because of the volatility of what was being stored in there. So the earliest manifestation of these buildings was way out of town, and in the armories become way more centralized into the cities and villages, mostly cities, small cities at that point. So by the time we get to this 1858, they're kind of becoming stylish. The volunteer militia became a very important, it was emerging as a kind of the early middle class leisurely group of men that had the time to gather and join the volunteer militia and be ready to be called out to action, whether that was perform in a parade or take down a small strike in the 1830s. So that is the initial evolution, but towards the end of the arsenal before we move into the actual armory building. I go way off. I don't know. See, I've also given Tom and Richard permission to interrupt me and say, "Boy, that was not my question. She's talking too much." So did that answer your question essentially at this point?
That does. I thank you very much for that. I think you raise a good point. We have a lot of ground to cover today.
Yeah.
So I will make sure that we all stay as close to being on time as we possibly can. So if we need to, I'll let you all know that we need to stop and move on to the next topic. But before we leave this topic, I have one quick question about arsenals. Are any still standing in New York? Any of the dozen or so that you mentioned.
Yes, in fact, if we have anybody here from the Capital District, there is one still standing in Ballston Spa. It happens to have been modified a couple times over the decades, and it's now the Christ Episcopal Church Annex. So for decades and decades, it's had a cross on top. It has a tower instead of this crenellated parapet in the middle of this particular armory. But if you look at the one in Ballston Spa, you can say, oh yeah, I see. Despite the cross, it was an armor. It was an arsenal.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So go ahead.
In your book, it seemed to me that arsenals in urban areas, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, New York City, might have been bigger in their larger facilities. Is that just because there were more units I mean, is that simply the issue? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
No, that's it. More soldiers, more troops. That was it. More volunteers.
Got it. Well, let's talk a little bit about, sort of get into a little bit of the DNA of armories. And so,
yeah, if you go to the next slide.
Yeah.
I think to talk about architecture is to talk about the brains behind a lot of what was created from the late 1800s up to the mid 20th century. And we chose to talk about that through 4 architects who were very, I would say, their work was very prevalent. There were a lot of armories built by them, and we start with Isaac Perry, who, I don't know, Nancy, perhaps I'm overstating this. He was kind of the mentor, if you will, of subsequent architects, but he certainly was a pathfinder, particularly as it related to armories in upstate New York. And then George Hines, who was a protege, I would like to call him a protege of Perry, as well as Louis Pilcher. And then in the 20th century, we see William Hogarth, who was influential in a lot of the mid 20th century armories that were built. But we're going to go step by step.
Got it. And some of these folks, I think they had a dual role. They were also the state architect, at least Hogarth and Pilcher were. And so I think Pilcher designed Attica Prison, and Hogarth built or designed the Smith Building here in downtown Albany. So you can see their work outside of the armory context as well. Yeah. But let's talk about armories, and let's start by talking about Isaac Perry.
So I think that we Nancy, you can give us a lot of color on this one, but again, I think it's fair to say that Perry's work was mostly in upstate New York, and that armories basically that were built not only in upstate New York but in the metropolitan areas as well, had functions. And Nancy, if you want to talk a little bit more about those functions as we've outlined them here, that would be great.
Oops, I did not mean to. I didn't maximize myself, did I? I screwed up. Anyhow, but yes, Isaac Perry, almost all of his armories were in upstate New York, and about 26 of them, let's say approximately. And there were a couple in New York City, but for most after 1884, all upstate armories were built by the New York State architect. Starting in 1884, there was a New York City Armory Board that was in charge of the funding and construction and oversight of all, in the 5 boroughs, of all of those armories. So they're very, very different in terms of how they got funded. Not necessarily if they looked like, they all tended to look like monumental medieval inspired castles. A lot of it had to do with the scale, basically the scale. They could be, the smaller company might be 10 or 12,000 square feet, and some of the bigger regimental or division armories could be as much as 60,000 square feet. So a lot of it has to do with the actual size of the facility. But anyhow, so in upstate New York, they were all designed by the governor-appointed state architect, and Perry had already established himself as a very talented architect, popular in all sorts of buildings, primarily Richardsonian Romanesque, which gets translated into the armories, which works very well with medieval castles. So we're spending most of our time in this show on upstate armories that are basically separate company armories, occasional some of the regimental armories in the bigger cities. And it's a whole different ball of wax for the New York City and maybe even the Buffalo armories. But you know, at the moment, they all have very similar characteristics. They all had drill sheds that were now engineering possibilities that were inspired by the 1870s discoveries of how to build train sheds or centennial exhibition halls, and massive, open, covered, unobstructive floor space where the troops could drill. Prior to that, they had to drill in the village green or out in somebody's farm, but they could only do it in good weather. So the point of the drill shed was inside, the ability to drill and practice inside all year long. And then the administration building held the other stuff. And I think, as Richard mentioned before, he said something about his office was in the tower next to the armory. And that's true. I mean, the office stuff was in the quote unquote administration building. And the rear, the biggest, 80% of the facility was a drill shed. So that's kind of the architecture of it. Is that?
Without trying to jump ahead,
yeah, please do.
The function of the armory in upstate New York might have differed slightly from the function of an armory or the purpose of an armory in the metropolitan area. Is that fair to say, or is?
Yeah. Why? Oh my gosh! I've lost my. Oh my God! I am incompetent. Am I still speaking?
You are.
Yep.
All right, good, because I couldn't find my icon to unmute, so I'm going to have to leave it. But yes, and absolutely, very, very different, and primarily the earliest, most imposing, impressive armories really started in New York City, and we'll get to that in a minute when we take a look at the 7th Regiment Armory. But primarily during the third quarter of the 19th century, post-Civil War, post-economic panic of 1873 was a period of labor capital conflict and the quote unquote dissidents and rebels that were challenging the status quo of, certainly the status quo of the quote unquote elite and even the middle class at that point. So the city, especially New York City armories, the role of the National Guard, most of the time was being called out to quell riots. The riots had started in New York City as early as the 1830s. The Astor Place riot in the 1830s, 1837, I think, a ridiculous riot by 2 theater groups that were arguing about who was the best Macbeth. Was it an American actor or a British actor? And it was one of the bloodiest riots in the streets of the theater district. The National Guard had to be called out. So it wasn't just dissidents that were, railroad strikers. It was anybody that was kind of causing some disruption. So I have to be very careful about, what their primary reason was. Was it putting down those horrible socialists and anarchists? Not necessarily. Sometimes maybe. There's different interpretations. So yes, and there certainly were some strikes in upstate New York, Buffalo and Syracuse and things like that. In Saratoga, I don't know. I know there was one in Gloversville in the early 20th century, but again, it's very localized. It's a glove factory. So it's not like not the glove workers are going to take over the country, whereas some of the anarchists looked like they possibly could. So very different roles. But equal status, equal importance, equal monuments to the role of the government in the present, to inspire nationalism, community pride, especially because they were so local. It was your brother, your cousins, your uncles that all belonged to the same unit, your neighbors. So it was very different. It was a very community-minded spirit, in addition to obviously the primary role as the backbone of the American military system up until World War I.
Go ahead.
No.
This is the Saratoga Armory, Saratoga Springs Armory, which is now the home of the New York State Military Museum. And I wonder, I got this slide, but I've got another one just that follows it. You talked about the various components of the armory, right? And we've got a number of them here. This comes right out of your book, Nancy. And what are the pieces that would have made up an armory? You know, starting with two, or actually one. You know, what are these various sort of standard elements that make up an armory? I think this is a way to help people understand when they're looking at these buildings, what are all these pieces and what do they do?
Okay, initially, I mean, so were you going to put up the slide of the Saratoga Armory that had the numbers on it?
Yep, that's the one right now. Yep. So here's
I've got. I'm not. Well, what am I doing? Okay,
you
I'm
can
not
barely see the one is just it's right out of the
What? Yeah, if it helps, I can tell you what each of those are, and that.
Now I'm going to pull out my paper copy because somehow I've managed to have you and me and Josie on there that has not the slide. So I'm not going to tinker with getting the slide up. I know
Number one is
exactly
the
where we
Sally
are.
Port.
Yeah. Okay. Anyhow, so yeah, basically a lot of these are derived from these characteristics are derived from medieval military architecture. And so we start with, like, if you look at the number one, which is hard to see on this, but it's a giant arch, primarily of masonry. And within inside that arch is what's called, that's Sally Port. And that's wide enough that all the troops, you know, maybe 6 or 8 abreast could walk in and out and storm out and get the rebels on Main Street in Saratoga, which isn't true, but you know, that was their purpose. They could all storm out together or file back in after a parade. Inside Sally Port was a portcullis, which is a very, very strong metal gate that slides and again keeps out the riffraff or just keeps the protection inside, you know, whatever you want. But again, it's more of a statement, it's more of a visual statement. Again, community pride and the presence of, you know, this great community organization, a civic monument, basically. That's what it is. It's what it is. I'm not going to go into the types of towers and roofs and conical versus octagonal versus. But another important thing is the late 19th century armories were all load-bearing masonry. So number 6 says it's called a battered foundation. And what that means is that it slopes outward at the base to bear the weight. Now in the armories, they tended to be much thicker than necessary to hold up the weight. But again, the theory was that if the rebels attacked the armory, they can't get through the battered foundation. And that was very important in New York City. But anyhow, they carried on that tradition. Again, it was kind of a visual cue that that's what was going on in the armory, and don't mess with these people. Or come see us as we go out for a parade to honor the centennial celebration of something. So yeah, some of it's not necessarily super practical. It was never called into action. But there are features like on a lot of the armories that they will replicate medieval castles and fortresses, like a crenellated parapet that has like the notched. We'll see that maybe in a couple hours. Yes, when we get to Hines, they're a notched thing. Now in medieval times, they had the notches so they could pour boiling oil on the attackers. Okay, they're not going to do that in Saratoga or anywhere upstate. Anyhow, and then the rifle slits where you really could hunker down behind behind the parapet and put your rifle out through the rifle slits and fire on the people below. So again, 9 times out of almost, I don't know if an armory is ever attacked. Basically, the National Guard went out to fulfill its duty. Nobody really attacked the armory that they really had to use the, you know, option of boiling oil or rifle slits. But they could if they needed to. So anyhow, that's the administration building. We can't really see in this slide of Saratoga, but behind that front administration, you see peeking out on the edge of that is this giant, massive drill shed, probably 10 to 12,000 square feet. Let's say the administration building could have been, I don't know, I'm making this up, so don't quote me. I don't know, 3,000 square feet. So you get the idea that the drill shed was the biggest and most important, and really the reason that these armories existed in the first place, for drilling and practicing of the troops all year round. And not the administration buildings were afterthoughts, but they were secondary.
Got it.
This is Ogdensburg. You can see that there's instead of a conical roof, which you saw in the earlier Saratoga Armory, this is looks more like a castle. And I think, Nancy, there were some roofs of these towers that were changed. I think from conical to castle, or castle to conical.
Right.
Isn't that fair to say? I mean, I
Yeah,
think
in fact, the current Saratoga Armory no longer has the pointed roof on the towers. I'm pretty sure it's flat and crenellated, but again, I'd have to look that up. I used to know all this stuff, but I'd forgotten it. In 20 years since the book came out, I've forgotten the details of a lot of stuff. But yes, you're absolutely right. They could change with styles, or simply to replace something that was crumbling. Right. Whatever.
You were talking about the foundation, and what you call in your book the battered foundation. I call it the two-tone armory, but basically a lot of armories you'll see are what I'll call two-tone with
yes.
that battered foundation. So that's
yes.
a real, very, very much a trademark of
yes.
Perry, and I think more so in the rural areas than in the urban area.
Yes.
The battered or two-tone effect was more prevalent.
Absolutely, and it also depended on where in the state you were building this. I mean, you can see in the Saratoga Armory, it's a fairly, maybe 2, 3, 4 feet of stone, but you get up to Ogdensburg where everybody had Potsdam sandstone, and you get these massive displays of gorgeous stonework. Not because they were any better or any richer, but because that's what was available. So you look at the arches on the Ogdensburg and the stonework up to the entire first level of that tower. So yeah, depends on what was available at what cost.
Right. Yeah, good. And the Ogdensburg Armory is also a Perry creation. And again, it upstate New York, and it has the features. And we're going to talk a little bit more, but these armories, and I think Nancy, you alluded to it earlier, and certainly do in your book, a lot, particularly in the rural areas, these armories were more or less central to the town in which they were built, so that they weren't way out in the hinterlands. They were in plain sight in the middle of a town. Right?
Absolutely. They were massive civic structures. So when you're saying you were using the word rural, you mean less populated regions of the state, because even in the least populated, Ogdensburg wasn't a very big area, but it was in the heart of the city of Ogdensburg. So yes, and that had to do with how quickly and how conveniently the troops could get there. Was there a streetcar? Did they have to go by horse? Did they go by horse for a mile? They couldn't go 30 miles out as in the 1930s, when the armories really truly moved to the suburbs. A lot of it had to do with transportation, the evolution of different transportation. So yes, A, it was there for convenience, but B, as to serve as a monument at a local level. So we are here, and this is what we're all about. So they were as important as the biggest possible church or cathedral or city hall, or that's the Carnegie Library, whatever. They were as important civic structures, monuments to the community. So yeah, they were they were so everybody could see it downtown.
And quite frankly, as we'll talk about a little bit later, there was being so near center city or center town, it became a social magnet as well. So the Armory now became another part of its DNA was the importance of it being a social magnet, basically, for lack of a better term. Yeah. So that's Perry. That kind of gives you an idea of Perry. We're gonna move on from Perry to a fellow by the name of George Hines, and he was kind of Perry a protege, and I think that you'll see in a lot of the armories, and Nancy, you can elaborate on this, but the towers are either round or octagonal, and I think that you talk in your book a little bit about the round versus that sometimes the octagonals were starting to take a little bit more of a place of the round towers, and again you mentioned the structural steel in many cases later on. And again, we gave you the chronology of each of these architects to basically point out there's an evolution involved. And not to digress, but going back to the Ogdensburg, don't go back, but if you take early postcards of armories and you look at the later postcards of the armories, you'll see that things are built up around them. The trees are bigger, that they're, just different things have happened. But there's an evolution that takes place in armory construction from a technical or architectural standpoint that's important. So anyway, but if you could just tell us a little bit more about Hines, it would be great.
Well, I think your slide, I think the key thing there is the structural steel, the progress in engineering, and building sciences, enabled the replaced the virtually not affordable any longer.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily stylistic, but I think your point about it, the method of construction was, the method of construction really changed. Not some, I mean, yeah, certainly if you knew, you could tell the difference between a Perry and a Hines armory, but not necessarily. Go to Gloversville and look at the Hines armory, and there's no reason you couldn't be convinced that Perry did it, because it looks similar, but as you mentioned, it's the method of construction. I did want to make one comment. You'd mentioned the postcards. The reason there are literally thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not more, postcards of armories is because they were so important. Right up there with the thousands of postcards of city halls. So the mention of the postcard, I think, is really interesting and kind of pivotal, that justifies our claim of how important they were.
But and not that I read other people's mail, but when I find another postcard that actually has been used, generally
Yes.
it's the message has nothing to do with the armor, but
Right.
says we're having a great time in Ogdensburg, or
Yes.
we met so and so and so and
Yes.
so. Nothing to do with the armory, but the armory was center stage
Absolutely.
for a postcard, and it made a lot of sense.
Right. They were attractive, and they were visually pleasing and good thing to send to your relatives. What's really funny is to find postcards that are written in a different language, many of which went back to Western Europe. But it's just funny that if some French family was visiting Ogdensburg, they'd write a postcard on an Ogdensburg armory in French. So it does show that they were very important.
This is the Geneva Armory, which is having a bit of an identity crisis. If you can see, the towers are not uniformly round nor uniformly octagonal or hexagonal. But nonetheless, this is one of Hines's armories, and this was in Geneva, New York. Basically, this armory was put into service in 1906. And I think it is a good representation of his work.
And here's another example, which is a postcard. Probably my favorite armory in New York.
Yeah. This is another two-tone armory, as you can see, and again, it is surrounded, if you will, by other structures, which suggests that it's not out in some field in nowhere land. It's in Center City.
Yes, it is.
And I think, if you look hard, you could probably see Tom peeking out of one of the windows there. Anyway.
But you can see the drill shed behind. This is one because of the angle of this picture.
Right.
The drill shed, which just goes back off almost into the horizon behind the tower.
That's exactly. Yeah. I think that we're talking a lot about, and we're not going to be able to get into it today because of the time, but we're going to be talking a lot about the outside of the armory. And I think it might be helpful at some point in the future, we do another one of these broadcasts with talking about the inside of the armory, because some of these armories inside were spectacular. As spectacular as they are outside, they're spectacular inside.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway,
want to talk about Louis Pilcher?
Yes, Louis is next. Nancy, I would again defer to you in terms of, the only thing I want to interrupt on is the last bullet point about Barton Hall. But anyhow, any observations about Louis that you'd like to make would be great.
No, I think the slide covers it. Essentially, it's continuing evolution of building sciences, engineering capabilities, carrying on the same traditions, other than militarily wise. After World War One, the National Guard became the reserves, because after World War One, the centralized, regular, federally controlled army of professional soldiers replaced the citizen soldiers of old. So these sort of they go down a bit of a notch, not in terms of importance, but maybe profile. And so the regular soldier under control of the federal government takes over as the primary, the backbone of the American military structure, whereas the National Guard up until World War One was the primary, the only, basically, any centralized troops that would be mustered up for various things. But essentially, Central Army did not exist of professional soldiers till after World War One. So I think the rest of it, I think we should just move on. I mean, there's too many others. I think we go on. Let's move on to Barton Hall. All right.
This is Barton Hall.
Yeah.
I mentioned the armories that I was associated with when we first started this. This actually I was associated with probably more intimately than any of the other armories. This currently houses not only an inordinate amount of entertainment events and athletic events in a massive drill floor that you see behind the armory itself. Again, lending credence to the notion that there's an administrative space, and then there's a drill space, if you will, whether it was drilling on horseback or drilling on foot, there was a drilling space. Barton Hall currently houses the three components of ROTC instruction at Cornell University. And I had the privilege of being a youngster when my father ran the Army ROTC program at Cornell University. And I had free reign on the weekends of Barton Hall. So I got to know all the nooks and crannies at Barton Hall. And again, under sort of the overall evolution of form and purpose of these armories, this was a much more utilitarian, much more, much less fancy, if you will, for the lack of a better word. There was much less wood. There's much less just style in these armories. These were really built for function, and I think that's an evolution, Nancy. Wouldn't you say that saw its beginnings with Pilcher?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Here's just another view of Barton Hall.
Barton Hall.
Get another good sense of the enormity of the building. If this has got to be over an acre in space,
yeah.
I would imagine.
Oh yeah,
in terms of what it covers.
Currently they have what's called the heptagonals, which is a track and field event, and all the track and field events within that meet or take place inside of Barton Hall. I mean, it's really incredible.
Amazing.
And yeah, I just.
So can we turn our attention to the 7th Avenue, or 7th Regiment Armory in New York a little bit? We've talked a lot about upstate. I think it's worthwhile sort of turning our attention to, there's one of the biggest and most important armories in the state is in New York. There's another one. So can we talk a little bit about the 7th Regiment Armory?
Okay. Have you got the writing up, or have you actually got the picture up yet?
I don't have the picture. I just have the writing.
Okay, the writing. Okay, well, in a nutshell, because we could spend 2 hours on the 7th Regiment Armory alone. But basically built in 1877 to 81. Designed by Charles Woodall says that, but it was funded primarily by the 7th Regiment, which was also called the Silk Stocking Regiment, because they were definitely the cream of the crop of the New York Manhattan elite at that time. So they had the money, and they hired, Louis Comfort Tiffany and Stanford White to do a lot of the interiors, which is actually unheard of in any of the other armories, but they could afford it. And back to what I was saying earlier, this was before the New York City Armory Board, but the state was not really giving anybody any money in 1877. So the 7th Regiment undertook to construction project all on its own. But they were a very, very famous regiment anyhow from the get-go back as far as the 1820s or earlier. They were prominent, obviously prominent families. They were called out for parades and celebrations and inaugurations of whatever. So they were extremely popular. So not only could they fund it themselves, but they could raise money from other important people that had, the venture capitalists of the era. So yes, they had access to the money, whereas very few other units did.
And here's a picture of it, one of the many postcards of it. We've got a couple of them.
Yeah.
Yes, and it
And again,
actually
you can see the difference.
It does not look like that anymore. There have been some alterations, and Richard referred to that earlier, where towers were shortened and roofs were changed, or whether the tower fell down or they decided to take it down, doesn't matter. But so it's actually 5 stories now instead of instead of just this 2.5 at this point with the mansard roof. So this one has changed over the decades. But yes, this is how it was built. It first appeared on Avenue.
1879, right? Nancy was
started in 77, opened its doors in 79, and then Tiffany and Stanford White probably finished the stuff in, let's say, 81, or it might have, gone a few, each, and that's an interesting thing. Each separate company, within the regiment, there were 8 companies at that time, and the composition of the military structure changed, the organization changed, but at that time there were 8 companies. So each of the 8 companies were individual units joined together in this regiment, but each company was trying to outdo the other one on they had meeting rooms. Each company had its own meeting room, which goes throughout armory history, but especially the bigger ones. So it's interesting that, the companies competed to have the finest the finest detailing, and they all pooled their money to make with the veterans room, and that's where Tiffany outshines. So
I had occasion when I was in the Guard to go to the 7th Regiment Armory. At the time, it was the headquarters of the 1st Brigade of the 42nd Division, of which I was part of by virtue of my assignment at Kingsford Road. And we would go over for meetings with division commander or ADC or whatever. And I think, the inside, although in those days, and this is a number of years ago, more than I care to remember, but in those days, it was still, even in its sort of beginning of its downward slope in terms of maintenance, it was still an awesome, and I mean it not in the way people use it today, but it was an awe-inspiring adventure to go to the 7th Regiment Armory. But as you know, and Nancy can attest, there were sporting events that took place in the 7th Regiment Armory. There were social events that took place in the 7th Regiment Armory. There are still art shows and other antique fairs and what have you that take place in the 7th Regiment Armory. It really is a fine structure, and its history is I think incredible. It's one of those where we Tom and I have talked about the possibility of doing a deeper dive into 2 or 3 armories in the future, with the 3 of us doing a deeper dive into a couple of these armories and looking at the inside as well as the outside. And I think it would be well worth anybody's time who lives or is near the metropolitan area to take a look at the 7th Regiment Armory. It really is a marvelous, and again, I know my father, who is very involved, and my grandfather, very involved in the Guard in New York, always called this the silk stocking regiment and the silk stocking armory.
I can see we've got some questions starting to pile up, and I want to make sure we have enough time for them. I want to shift a little bit to military affairs and the armories. We talked about the buildings quite a bit, but let's talk a little bit about what the armories were being used for from a military perspective. Can you talk about?
Well, I think to start this off, Nancy, I'll just say we've covered some of the ground. I mean, arsenals first got their inspiration, I think, early, very early, and we see early ones even around the time of the War of 1812, and then it became more prevalent in their construction in the mid 18 or early 1800s, 30s to let's say 50s. And interesting, and Nancy, in your book, you made an interesting comment that the weapons, the local militia stored their weapons at home, but they stored munitions at the arsenal, which I thought was kind of interesting. I said, boy, talk about Second Amendment. I mean, are you kidding? This is crazy. But it was, but that's precisely what happened. They would store their weapons at home, but they'd store their ammunition and other munitions in the arsenals. So there was a clear military purpose for an arsenal, and some of the DNA we've talked about in terms of social was not yet a factor in the arsenals. If you want to go on, Nancy, I can take this, or we can, I think the early armories were built for the local units, right, Nancy? And we see, and one area we have not focused on are the big, what I'll call the big urban areas, Buffalo, Rochester, and Brooklyn. We've talked about the 7th Regiment Armory, but we haven't talked about Brooklyn. Brooklyn had some incredible armories and real fortresses down there that were built. But I think the early armories being smaller, the upstate towns were separate company. You in your book talked about different armories. For example, Saratoga, the 22nd separate company, was built for that company. It was not built for a regiment. But right. On the other hand, the armory in Buffalo was built for a regiment. The right. Armories in Brooklyn were built for regiments. 7th Regiment was built for the regiment. And, right. and I think that was an important distinction, if you will, but part of the reason why armories differed throughout.
Right, right.
And we've got here's a good example. This is, I think, from the 7th Avenue Armory, just the size of that drill space.
Yeah, and if you think that's big,
we'll get there.
Hold on, you're right. We've got preview of coming attractions.
But here's an example of a smaller armory with a small company, Company G, leaving. This is, again, from my favorite armory in beautiful Gloversville.
Now, that is the guy in the back is Tom. He's just
go
to war.
Okay. He's aged very, very well.
I've aged. Yes. Yeah. But this is you can talk a little bit about this space.
Well, this my father used to talk. This is Kingsbridge Road. This is where the 258 Field Artillery, which I commanded, was housed. This drill floor was the drill floor used by most of the metropolitan New York regiments to drill, because it was one of the few drill floors that you could get an entire regiment on the drill floor. It was 180,000 square feet, 600 by 300. And I can tell you that I came to the armory one time for drill, and there was a superstructure in the middle of the armory, and I asked what it was, and they said, well, we've just out for a movie that's being shot, and we're going to crash some cars in. We have a machine which simulates car crashes, and we're going to use that for this. But I mean, you talk about circuses. You could have 3 circuses with big tops in this armory. It really was massive, and I every time I walked out of my office to the drill floor, I was awed by it. I really was. It was fantastic. If you look under where it looks like there's a seating on the second level there by the walls, underneath were where the offices were, except for the towers, where the towers basically held other offices. But down below them is where a lot of the offices were, and it was again right in the middle of everything. The Kingsbridge Road Armory. It was 1892, I believe, was the date on the Kingsbridge Road Armory, but it was an awesome place to go to. It really was. It was awe-inspiring, I should say. Awesome is overused, but awe-inspiring place to be.
Absolutely, absolutely.
180,000 square feet. you said?
180,000 square feet.
Massive.
Yeah, and a lot of the
Let's
other regimental armories were, maybe 60, 80,000 pops. So yes, this is
Right,
massive.
right,
And at that
exactly.
point,
This
you
is
can
three
barely,
times that size.
Richard mentioned looking closely for the seats. And the point is the seats are so tiny, you can barely see them compared to the size of the drill shed. But there's thousands of seats in there. So again, which you can barely see, but they're there.
Let's shift a little bit to talk a little bit about the social role of these armories. In large
Yep.
cities, armories were usually home to stocking outfits.
Right.
So I'll toss this over to you. You've got some personal connections.
Well, I think that we saw armories in Rochester, as well as in New York City, become social magnets. And I know that in some of the smaller towns, not only the military organization that was situated in the armory, but the people around it, the village or towns or city folk, all gravitated to the armory as a place to have an event. And the armories, for example, the units within the armory were often asked to do certain types of civic functions. For example, my unit was an artillery unit at Kingsbridge Road. Every year we were asked to provide 2 howitzers with prime movers to participate in the Purim Day parade in Brooklyn, because they wanted to have a military presence. The significance of Purim being that it's a Jewish holiday, which is very significant, and it has to do with saving people and an action which would save them. And so that the significance of having an artillery piece in the parade was significant. My troops grumbled about it, but when they got done with it, they were very happy to have done it. I think the other thing we did in terms of parades, the 258 traces its lineage. My unit, the 258, traced its lineage to the honor guard that accompanied was with George Washington when he was inaugurated, and that we were asked at the 200th anniversary of the inauguration to lead the parade down Broadway to the Federal Square to basically commemorate that inauguration. So I, along with pieces of my battalion, paraded down the street, down Broadway to commemorate that. But again, I think we've hosted in the upstate armories, we've hosted unit dining ins, for example, which is an event which units have, battalions in particular have, retirement parties, receptions, and of course, as I mentioned before, with Barton Hall and the 7th Regiment, sporting events. And and as we said before with the 7th Regiment, they still do that. And Nancy, any other color that you want to throw in there?
No,
that was my
absolutely no.
experience.
No, you definitely touched on everything. Is because they gravitated there because there was nothing else in the community. These were the civic centers and arenas. There was no Knickerbocker Arena or Pepsi Arena or whatever we call it now. The only thing in town was the giant drill shed. So yes.
Right. And just here's an example. This is a program for Colonel Pendry,
right,
on his retirement.
Right.
And just an example of the kind of event. And it's a great program. You have the complete program. We're just showing you the highlights, including a photo of Colonel Pendry.
My father attended this for Colonel Pendry. The armory you see on the cover page is the 13th Regiment Armory in Brooklyn. And you can see how massive that appears, even in a small caricature of it. It was a big armory. And again, the 13th Regiment became the 245th Coast Artillery, which was very important in terms of harbor defense in the city of to the city of New York. But Colonel Pendry was retiring, and the rest of the brochure includes menus and signature cards where people who attended all signed, your program. So
Very
it was
cool.
kind of cool.
And just speaking of Harbor Defense of New York City, that's another wonderful program. You can go to our YouTube channel and learn a little bit more about it, hosted by my colleague here, Colonel Comstock. We talked a lot. I shouldn't say we've talked a lot. We have talked a lot, but we've barely brushed the surface of all these great armories across New York. They're in everyone's town. Everyone has some experience with them. I can't recommend enough this wonderful book that Nancy has written and put together, and it's now 20 years old. Nancy?
Published 2006. Published 2006.
So almost 20 years old. It's a wonderful book. It's available at the gift shop at the New York State Military Museum. And if you have any struggles getting there, reach out to us. Josie Madison will come on in just a minute and let you know our website address, and you can reach out to us and we'll figure out a way to get a copy of the book to you. But it's a wonderful resource. And Nancy, thank you so much for that. I want to wrap up by just reminding everyone that these armories had people in them, including the one color photo we have here of the person sitting next to me here. But these were the soldiers who we celebrated and honored yesterday, who we should celebrate and honor every single day of the year, who have given us so much and who have given us these wonderful buildings that they inhabited and often called home. And so as you pass by the armory in your town, or that you visit one, remember the faces of some of the people that have been in there, and the people that helped make our communities and our country what it is. So with that, I know there's a ton of questions piled up. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to stop sharing so that Josie can bring them on.
Great. Yes, there are a lot of questions. So I'm going to try to get to as many of them as we can. And I think the first question I'm going to pitch to you is why was the medieval castle style the kind of architectural style that was selected for armories?
Well, in general, because it was designed to look like a scary fortress of a very strong military, that it was, certainly to instill pride and, patriotism, but it was also supposed to instill fear in any possible insurrection. And what better to do that than a fortress or a castle of medieval? Well, plus it was also our roots that Americans, we had our roots, and a lot of our inspiration for architecture in general came from Western Europe sources. But it just lent itself well to be an imposing, monumental, awe-inspiring fortress.
Great. One of our guests also noted that, a lot of these armories, obviously the architectural style is similar, and a lot of times are the stones and the bricks that are actually used to build them the same? Sometimes they look the same. Are they from the same places? Is it different?
They would be from the regional source, and it just depended on, what was readily available and cost efficient. So again, I think I mentioned earlier, up in Potsdam or out in Medina, in the other side of further out between Buffalo and Rochester, they have Medina sandstone. So it would pretty much depend on the regional availability of materials. Yeah, the bricks would be made locally probably at that time. Who knows, in the 20th century, they sourced them out of state because they were affordable. But no, it was all regional, local materials.
Okay, and then we've had a couple of questions about one of our guests read an article that the Kingsbridge Armory is going to be repurposed as a business hub. So can you talk about that specific example and maybe some other examples of successful adaptive reuse of armories?
So the Kingsbridge Armory has been proposed for rehabilitation, reuse for decades and decades. It's so monumental. It's so ridiculously cost prohibitive, but nonetheless, there continue to be plans. And a lot of these armories, when I started researching the book, Division of Military and Naval Affairs owned 28 active armories. as of about a year ago, there are only 6 left under control of the National Guard. So they disposed of a lot of them. And some of them, they would give to the local community for $1. Oneonta, for example, has turned their armory, the Heinz Armory from the 19 teens, have turned it into a sports facility. It's still a community. It is their civic center, basically. There are a number that just have been turned into community purposes. Anybody knows the Schenectady Armory, that's where the Van Gogh multimedia show was. So that actually was purchased by a friend of mine who had enough money to buy the armory and has turned it into this. So yeah. But unfortunately, a lot of them got knocked down. A lot of them just got abandoned and fell down because they could not afford to be maintained. And there was not the incentive. They were often looked at as, oh my God, what are these ugly Victorian, ridiculous, old buildings? Knock them down and put up a 1930s whatever. Yeah, so a lot of it had to do with the economic feasibility of maintaining them at all. Imagine the cost of heating one of those facilities now.
Some of our guests have some questions about, if they had family members in the military, they know what regiment they were in, how might they find, what armory they belonged to, and if there were any records from that armory or any way to sort of track down more information about their relatives. Is there a good resource?
Well, the Saratoga Museum, but Richard, you want to address this some more, Tom?
I think a couple of different places they can look. First, going to the Military Museum in Saratoga Springs, just contact them, Google their website, and you'll get some information on how to reach out to them. You can contact the State Archives. We have some military service records, particularly for soldiers who served in World War I. And then finally, the Division of Military and Naval Affairs continues to maintain the personnel records of Guards people, and they will also be able to give you some information on the service and where those individuals were. You might have to do some work of sort of connecting the regiment to what armory the regiment would have worked out of or been deployed out of. That's not terribly difficult. Use Nancy's book.
I was going to say,
connecting a couple of dots might be necessary. But again, for individual information, the Military Museum, Division of Military and Naval Affairs, or we'll just call it DMNA because it's easier to say, and then the State Archives. And if you go to our website, there's all kinds of information on military service records, as well as access to the records themselves.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. We have some guests who are sort of coming to us from the perspective of their hometown armories, or in one case, one person works at the Albany Armory. Can you, just special request, make some comments about the Albany Armory and the Newburgh Armory?
Which one? The
New Scotland Avenue or the Washington Avenue? Well,
which
I would
Albany
go with
one?
Washington Avenue, Nancy.
I'm sorry. The
Washington Avenue.
Okay. Yeah. Somebody. You know what? I didn't do a ton of. I'm not. I mean, that's where the patroons, right? Was that the basketball and Jim Coyne? Yes, my understanding is still active, but I did not have the luxury of following what happened at all these armories. There's the New Scotland Avenue Armory too, which I think might be associated with the medical school or something. So honestly, I'm not the expert. Tom, Richard, do you know what the uses of those are now?
The large Washington Avenue Armory is mostly used as an entertainment venue and a sports venue. And I will say I've been in that building a few times, even a little bit behind the scenes. It's still lovely inside. It's in wonderful condition. I'll say it was used in the pandemic. That's where I got my first vaccination. But so it does get used for different civic activities. And I believe New Scotland Avenue, which is another enormous facility on New Scotland Avenue. I believe that either the pharmacy school or
Sage. I think it's Sage.
Yes, the college over there is using it. So it's part of those campuses. So the buildings are still there. They're actively used. They're maintained. And I don't think there's any thought or conversation about doing anything negative with them.
Right, and they're in a vital community that can figure out how to keep them going.
Right.
Whereas, you know, yeah, well, yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
There's some
Yeah,
communities that just can't.
A little bit off the subject, but the armories in New York City, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s, were used as homeless shelters, which was unfortunate.
Yes, yes.
So a lot of them were used. I know Kingsbridge, at one point in time after I retired, was used as a homeless place. But you know, the unfortunate but true, which only
Right.
hastens their demise.
Yeah, and that's an important section of the Lexington Avenue Armory of the famous Irish regiment, the 69th, which we could again spend an hour on. But yes,
Yeah.
they have had a homeless shelter. They used to have homeless shelters in the drill sheds, which had thousands and thousands of cots
Oh yeah.
side by side. And then they did move to a more humanitarian approach to housing people that didn't have housing, so that, you know, they'd be in smaller rooms with their dorms. You weren't on a canvas cot 2 inches from the next person, but it served its purpose at the time. So yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the good news is we have a guest who just chimed in to say that she is a master's student currently working on her thesis on the current community use of armories in New York
Oh,
City. So
oh,
hopefully that
that's
information will be available.
excellent. Excellent.
So we'll look forward to the second phase of this program.
That's
and
right.
have that graduate student, when their paper is written, will or their thesis is written. That'll be
Yeah.
great. How to
Yeah.
connect the past to the present.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, I just want to thank all of you so much for joining us today and for just scratching the surface of the history of these amazing buildings that are scattered throughout our state. It's a fascinating subject, and thank you to everybody who joined us. If you're interested in learning more about what we do, you can visit nysarchivestrust.org. If you're interested in learning more about the resources available to you at the New York State Archives, that website is archives.nysed.gov. And it's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and have ideas for future programming, please don't hesitate to send us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov. And please don't forget to join us on Tuesday, December 10th at 12:30 p.m. for our next online speaker series, all about Arch, saving and stewarding Adirondack architectural history.
Oh, excellent.
Oh, we'll see you there.
Excellent. Aaron, is it Aaron Toby in
With
that?
Aaron
Oh,
Toby,
excellent.
Executive Director at Adirondack Architectural Heritage.
Excellent.
You can find out more about that program and register for free for that program at nysarchivestrust.org. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Richard, Tom, Nancy. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you,
This was
Nancy.
the highlight of my career, my 30-year career as an architectural historian. I have such a passion. So thank you for including me.
It's very evident, your passion. Thank you for sharing it. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye.